bit of Dan's background for the two of you who may not know who he is. Dan is the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. Previously, Dan worked on 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, and is really one of California's leading political strategists. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of U.S. Senator John McCain, and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan teaches a seminar course here at the Graduate School of Public Policy titled Political Issues, Political Communication, and Strategy. A little bit of logistical background or notes on the session today. If this is your first time joining us, we are obviously using the Zoom platform. And so with that, if you would mute your microphones and cameras, we'll be able to conduct this discussion in a very easy way. The usual format for these discussions is that Dan is going to lead off with about 20 minutes or so of commentary and introductory thoughts. And then for the balance of our 1 hour together, I'll be moderating your good questions to Dan as they come in. Due to the volume number of people that we're expecting on today's Zoom meeting, questions can be answered through the chat feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Just simply click on the chat feature, type in your question, and I'll be sure to relay those along to Dan. So very excited to having you join us today. I will stop my screen share and come back here into the screen. I am here at the Dean's Conference Room here at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy. And as we're all working remotely today, I know Dan is also working from his office. And welcome in Dan Schnur. Dan, over to you.
Pete, thank you so much for having me today. It's a great privilege to be part of the series, and I'm just thrilled to kick off what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation with Pepperdine alums. I see several of my former students in the participant room today. They're probably on hoping that I've come up with some new jokes since they took the class, and I will have to admit to them that I have not. So hang in there, guys. Alums, faculty, administrators, other members of the Pepperdine community. For those of you who don't know, I've had the great privilege of teaching at the School of Public Policy, thanks to Pete's very generous invitation, for the last 2 spring semesters. And I can't tell you what a tremendous experience it's been. The school, as all of you know, is a terrific one, and only getting better under Pete's leadership. It's really been a privilege to be part of it. But I do need to say a word for those of you who might not get to spend as much time with our extraordinary students as I have over the last couple of years. They really are amazing. And in addition to being smart and determined and bound for just unfathomable levels of success, I've already resigned myself to the fact that my future students are not going to believe me when I tell them that I know my current students as they go on to positions of acclaim and fame and influence. But over the last few semesters, as all of you know, the students, the entire Pepperdine community has faced a very unique set of challenges, most notably, but not limited to the impact that the virus had on us, forcing us to switch to remote learning this spring. And I just have to tell you that in addition to being smart, in addition to being determined, in addition to being world conquerors in training, this is the most resilient group of young people I've ever seen. And watching the way they've adapted and adjusted through all these challenges in this adversity has really been humbling for me. I told my students on the last day of the semester, I told them that they had been known prior to this as Generation Z, which is, I think, faintly pejorative, but as someone who has one foot both in the baby boom and the Generation X camps, those are not particularly complimentary names either. But what I told them is, I said, just like the previous greatest generation that overcame the adversity and challenges of a depression and a world war, what they overcome in fighting their way through the challenges presented by this virus and its aftermath, I really believe that they are going to be known in history as the next greatest generation for leading our country and our society forward through the same type of adversity that their great-grandparents did in the early and mid part of the 20th century. So I've begun to refer to them as Generation C, and I think that will end up being known in the ages as an acronym for America's next greatest generation. So Zach, Abby, Pauline, the rest of you, I suppose that's probably gone to your head a little bit. So why don't I switch gears right now, and we'll start talking some politics. The first thing I'll say to those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet in past programming is I'll come to today's conversation in the same spirit that I come into the classroom every week. And what my students know very well is that one of my biggest frustrations with higher education at every college, at every university that I've taught over the years, my biggest frustration, my biggest irritation are professors from the left or the right who mistake the privilege that we've been given to work with these incredible young people. And they think that that privilege instead gives them the right to use a bully pulpit from which to inflict, and I choose the verb inflict very specifically, to inflict their own ideology from the left or the right on those smart young people. And when I come into the classroom at Pepperdine every week, when I come into the classroom at the School of Public Policy every week, it's clear to me that these young people, they're so smart, they're so well read, they're so well prepared, they don't need me, nor do they want me to tell them what to think. They don't need me to tell them who to vote for or which party to register for. If I do my job right, I'm not telling them what to think. Hopefully what I'm doing at the very best is helping them consider how to think about the great issues and the great challenges of our politics and of our era. I always tell them, I said, if you really want to know what I think about the issues of the day, if you want to know what I think about healthcare and immigration, if you want to know what I think about job creation and taxes and education, I said, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But let's do that in office hours. Let's do that out of the classroom. And if you really want, you can take me for coffee or for lunch and we can talk about it then. And just so you know, I tell my students, I can be bribed. And the week after the midterm every semester, I hand out the grade for food matrix. It's very straightforward. They take me to the cafeteria at SPP or to Starbucks. Well, then maybe they go from a B to a B+. They take me to Mastro's or to Ruth Chris Morton's, and man, they're going straight to Washington. So, but in the classroom, as is the case today, I have enough respect for those of you who joined today's conversation, not to take sides, not to try to advocate for a candidate, a party, or a cause, other than excellent higher education for smart young people. And so what I'll do for the next 10, 15 minutes or so is offer you some thoughts on politics in the time of coronavirus, and then open up this conversation into a conversation and to answer as many questions as we're able to over the course of the time that's remaining. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk predominantly about how the virus will impact this year's campaign, as I see it. Second, I'll talk a little bit about the way the virus may change the way campaigns are run and how it may change the way elections are held. And then third, and this is something hopefully that we can get into in more depth and detail during the conversational period, I'd like to talk about a little bit about the potential long-term impact of the virus, particularly on our public policy. So let's start with this year's campaign. Now, as most of you know, and as I know the alums on in the meeting know, most elections at every level are referenda on the incumbent. And if there is an incumbent running for re-election, to president, to Congress, for governor, for mayor, whatever the office happens to be, I can promise you that under almost all circumstances, that incumbent office holder gets way too much credit when things are going well and way too much blame when things are going bad. And if we'd had this conversation 90 days ago, as we did in my classroom, we were already discussing about how not only would this election be a referendum on President Trump, but even more specifically, a referendum on his handling of the economy. And by that measure, Trump was looking like a very formidable candidate for re-election, given the strength of the nation's economy. The president is still going to face a referendum this fall, but it's looking increasingly likely that that referendum is not going to be on his handling of the economy, but more primarily on his handling of the challenge presented by the virus. And at least according to public opinion polling, the voters' judgment on President Trump as it relates to the virus is much less generous than their opinions of him on the economy. Right after the nation began to shut down, we saw what's known in political and media circles as the rally round the flag effect working on Donald Trump's benefit. And again, as most of you know, that rally round the flag effect is something we've seen throughout American history, that when the country faces some significant adversity, whether it's an economic downturn, war, a health crisis like this one, the immediate reaction of the populace is to rally around its leaders. And what we've seen over the years in times of war and in times of other times of crisis is the president enjoys a very pronounced bump in his approval ratings as the country comes together behind him. Now, over the last 60 days or so, we've seen a couple of things as it relates to the rally round the flag effect that the president is enjoying. Number one, right away, his numbers did increase by a notable margin. But what we've noticed since is that the increase in his public support and voters' impressions of his favorability and unfavorably, that increase was not as big as it has been for presidents in the past. And it didn't last as long. And in fact, right now, the president's approval numbers are pretty much back to where they were pre-pandemic. Now, most of that has less to do with the president himself and more to do with the times in which we live. As the nation becomes more and more partisan and more polarized, it's pretty clear that convincing voters to change their mind, particularly about a president, is a lot harder than it would have been in years past. But for whatever the reason, that rally around the flag effect that Trump enjoyed at the outset of the crisis really seems to have dissipated. And that presents a challenge to him heading for re-election. The main reason for that, well, actually, before I get to that, what that's meant as Trump's poll numbers have sifted back down to where they were earlier this year, that has led, not surprisingly, to a gain in a head-to-head polling matchups between the president and his primary competitor, Joe Biden. Now, Biden, over the last several weeks, has gained noticeably in the polls in most of the key swing states, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, the states that swung the election for Trump in 2016, as well as the other three key states in this year's election, Arizona and North Carolina and Florida. And what's most interesting about that shift toward Biden is almost entirely Biden's move upward in head-to-head matchups versus Trump. Almost entirely, that increase has come from older voters, from senior voters, very specifically, who are dissatisfied with the president's handling of the pandemic. One, as we all know, regretfully, tragically, there are a lot more cases in that age group than in younger generations. A lot more cases, and a lot more deaths. The other reason, though, that public opinion research has suggested that seniors have shifted, at least for now, from Trump to Biden, is that they, as they express in focus groups, have a greater context for comparison. If you're older, obviously, that means you've been alive longer. And if you've been alive longer, of course, that means that you have witnessed more presidents. And even though no previous president has faced a challenge like this one, older voters seem less likely to judge Trump favorably when they compare him to previous presidents of either party, Republican or Democrat, in contrast with the way they've handled crises of their own in the past. So let's get back to the question of the economy versus the virus, and which is going to be the primary issue on which the president is going to be judged for in his referendum this fall. So I'm going to, over the last 100 years, there have been 4 presidents who have lost their reelection campaign. Only 4 presidents in the last 100 years. Going backwards, that's George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Herbert Hoover. 100 years, only 4 presidents who've lost their reelection campaign. And the one thing they have in common, as I think you've all already figured out just by my listing them, is every single one of them ran for reelection during a time of economic downturn, when the economy is trending downward. And even FDR, at the depths of the Great Depression, when he ran for reelection, first in 1936 and then again in 1940, although the country was suffering greatly from an economic standpoint, unemployment numbers were going downward during his reelection year. So the president knows that the economy needs to be on an upswing for him to be reelected. Now, clearly, he wants the economy to recover for reasons far beyond politics. He knows, as do any of our political leaders in both parties, that this country simply cannot sustain, cannot survive without renewed economic growth. So there's a real public policy imperative there, of course, too. But from a strict political standpoint, whether he would cite those 4 previous examples or not, the president and his advisors know that if he is going to win that referendum in November, the economy needs to be heading in the right direction. And therefore, it makes sense for him, in addition to all the real world reasons, but for political reasons, it makes sense for him to encourage the reopening. Now, if Donald Trump's biggest challenge is now with senior voters, Joe Biden's greatest challenge, as he works to maintain his lead in the polls, his greatest challenge is with young people. Young voters, minority voters, Bernie Sanders' strongest supporters, and other components of the Democratic base. Each one of these voter groups are cohorts that represent the ideological base of the Democratic Party. These are the most progressive, these are the most liberal Democrats in the party. They wouldn't vote for Donald Trump under any circumstances, at least except for very small percentages of them. Biden's challenge is not winning them over, but simply motivating them to vote. And he knows, without looking too far back in time, he knows that if he looks back at 2016, this is one of the major reasons that Hillary Clinton lost. Not only because a lot of swing voters, working class voters, shifted from Democrat to Republican in the 2016 election in support of Donald Trump, but because the Democratic base, the voters I was talking about earlier, young people, minorities, Sanders supporters, and other liberals, simply did not turn out. Either they did not vote in the general election, or they voted for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. And Joe Biden is working feverishly, as are his advisors, to figure out a way to motivate those voters without driving away the political center. And of course, the allegations that Ms. Reid has made against Vice President Biden, suggesting that he behaved very inappropriately during the time that she was in his employ when he was a United States Senator in the 1990s. That is the potential to create a greater dynamic, a similar dynamic as well. Young women, particularly young single women, tend to vote overwhelmingly Democratic. But these issues are very central to them too. And if they simply chose not to vote, that could have a tremendously negative effect on Biden's candidacy. Joe Biden, and I'm going to wrap this up in just a minute because I really do want to open it up to a conversation. Biden's other challenge, less in terms of content and more in terms of structure, is a direct result of the virus. And this shifts us into a conversation of how the pandemic will change the way campaigns are run. But Donald Trump is omnipresent, even more than usual, even more than most presidents. He recently stopped holding his nightly briefings, as we all know. But he's extremely visible, has begun traveling around the country again, and he's begun hinting that he wants to begin holding some of the larger scale campaign rallies that he's held in the past. Joe Biden, on the other hand, and this is not a personal criticism of the man, Joe Biden, I think, has become somewhat of the Maytag repairman of the 2020 campaign. And for my former students who are in the meeting who might not be familiar with a reference to a television ad that ran back in the late 20th century, most of us older people remember the Maytag repairman is the sort of lonely character who sat in his office waiting for the phone to ring. And Biden, through no fault of his own, is trapped inside of his own house, inside of his own basement, struggling mightily to be heard in this discussion, while being overshadowed not just by Donald Trump, but by Andrew Cuomo, by Gavin Newsom, by Larry Hogan, by Mike DeWine, by Nancy Pelosi, by Mitch McConnell, Republican and Democratic office holders across the country who have a daily, tangible role in confronting the virus are receiving tremendous amounts of attention. Joe Biden, despite his very extended experience of public service, does not hold office now. And so being heard has become a great challenge for him. And what we're seeing from Biden, the struggle I referenced a moment ago, is the first test case we're seeing of how campaigns will be changed in the era of the coronavirus. Because we can't meet in person the way we have since politics began. That means no big rallies of the type that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders enjoys. That means no person-to-person, face-to-face campaigning of the type of which Vice President Biden is so comfortable. It means that we're campaigning online. And what I will say briefly, and we can come back to this later should you care to, is that heading into this election, of course, the Trump campaign has a huge online advantage, a huge advantage in terms of its online and social media operation over Biden. The Democratic audience, generally speaking, demographically speaking, tends to be more comfortable with online and social media than Republicans. But the time and effort that the Trump operation has put into building and growing its online and social media operation has created just an immense gap. I'll give you just one example of that. This goes back to 2016. And the statistics I'm going to give you reflect the number of unique online advertisements that the two campaigns ran. Now, what I mean by unique is not the number of ads they ran, or the number of times they ran advertisements, excuse me, but how many different advertisements they ran online and on social media targeted different segments of the electorate. Donald Trump's campaign in 2016 ran 5.9 million different advertisements online, allowing them to target very precisely the various voter subgroups that they were prioritizing in that campaign. While the Trump campaign ran 5.9 million ads in that election, the Clinton campaign ran 66,000 unique ads. And over the last 4 years, Trump's operation has improved dramatically to the point where his Facebook and Twitter followers absolutely dwarf Vice President Biden's. What I do, as my students will tell you in class, when I get excited about a topic like this one, is I tend to talk for longer than I promised. And I'm noticing the clock right now. And for all I know, Pete is frantically texting me, just saying, wrap it up, Schnur, we got to get to questions. And so even though I haven't gotten that text from you, Pete, I hear you. And although I did say at the outset that there were a couple of other things that I did hope we could cover, not just the way campaigns are run, but the way elections will be held, and then to talk about the longer term impact of the virus, let's see if we can find a way to work those two topics into the conversation now that it broadens. So what I will do belatedly and mercifully is wrap up this monologue. And I see that some questions are already coming in through the chat. I know Pete has some. And if my All-Star alums don't have some, I will be horribly disappointed. So Pete, how do we want to shift on? What's the next step?
Well, Dan, why don't I take the moderator's prerogative and ask just a couple questions. I do see the questions coming in. And again, for those of you who joined after the introduction, we are taking your questions in directly through the chat feature. If this is your first time on Zoom, and it would be hard to believe given these last couple of months that this is your first time on Zoom, but if it is, you'll see the chat icon in the bottom center of your screen. If you click on that and type in your questions, I'll take them here and fire them over to Dan. Dan, I wanted to get your thoughts on the international component to this and think about this at maybe 2 or 3 different levels. One of the things that's so unique about this crisis is that not only is it being experienced internationally or globally, but it does have an origin story. And we're not altogether sure what that origin story is. But suffice it to say that some, mostly on the right side of the aisle, to a degree the president, but also many Republicans in Congress, are talking more openly about wanting to hold hearings on the origins of the virus and certainly looking at China's role in either propagating the virus or at least not taking the steps necessary to mitigate what happened in those first weeks or months. I want to look at this specifically through a political lens and wondered what your thoughts were on attempts made, whether legitimately or just straight politically, to shift the focus away from the president's handling of the virus to thinking more specifically about China's role in the pandemic.
Boy, it's a terrific question, Pete. And this is one of the longer term impacts of the virus that I did want to talk about, because however long it takes, once we do manage to put this in the rear review mirror and return to what normal life post-pandemic looks like, one of the long-term fallouts is going to be the very damaging impact on the already damaged relationship between the two superpowers that currently exist in the world today, the United States and China. First thing to remind everyone is that US voters' suspicions toward China had been growing at a notable rate for a long time before the pandemic. The Pew Charitable Trusts have been polling on this question, how voters trust China since 2005. And at the beginning of this year, before most of us were aware of the pandemic, or at least of its potential impact on the United States, those numbers were at an all-time low. And in fact, the level of trust that American voters hold for China's leaders has dropped to over 20 points just in the last 3 or 4 years. So this dynamic was going on long before the pandemic reached the crisis that it has now, but it's certainly only exacerbated. And I suspect what will happen throughout the crisis and its aftermath, I am using this language very carefully, and I know, and to some of you it may sound like overstating. I suspect that going forward, we will look at the US-China's very competitive and often confrontational relationship almost as the new Cold War. And I think the level of suspicion and hostility between the two countries and their leaders, as we're seeing in both directions, has long-term geopolitical impact and long-term impact on our nation's politics. We've already seen in this nation that both presidential candidates are already going out of their way to paint their opponent as soft on China. The way our national leaders in presidential campaigns through the second half of the 20th century often tried to paint their opponents as soft on Russia. The biggest challenge, it seems to me, and I don't mean to divert from your question, Pete, but I think it's one that I want to at least raise, is the United States won the Cold War for any number of reasons. And we've talked a lot in class about this, not just because of its military strength, but its economic strength, its diplomatic strength, its worldwide presence. The United States, from the end of World War II until the fall of the Berlin Wall, devoted an immeasurable amount of time and effort and energy and resources to forming alliances around the world in an effort to face down that Soviet threat. And it seems to me that the biggest challenge for our country going forward, once there is a vaccine for the pandemic, is to move back out onto the world stage, to reject the isolationism that is becoming more and more pervasive within the base of both parties, to realize that the way to emerge triumphant in a confrontation like this one, as we learned 30 plus years ago, is through strength of our relationships around the world. And for the winner of this November's election, be it Trump or Biden and his successors, it seems to me that a critical component of standing up to and overcoming the challenge that China now presents is to remember that this is best accomplished as a team sport.
Well, and that gives me actually a great segue into pulling together a couple of the questions that have come in. One is on the subject, if China is a significant election issue, does some of Biden's past support, I think it's very fair to say that if there has been a drum that Trump has been beating on for decades, I mean, he is very much on the record in books and public speeches about his suspicions of China. Biden does not have that same history. So your thoughts on the impact specifically if China becomes an issue on Biden, and then related to this question about collaborations globally. Do you see a stage set for new international cooperation if China is seen as particularly belligerent? Certainly, we've seen this recently in the news. Australia recently called for investigations as to the origins of the virus. China snapped back through its public officials and threatened some trade sanctions. You wonder whether it is going to change the way different countries collaborate or partner in relation to China going forward.
Boy, two great questions. And if it's okay with you, Pete, I'll answer them in reverse order to start with the geopolitical and then move to the domestic politics. I think the premise of your second question, well, of both of your questions, is exactly right. But particularly on the international front, it is worth noting that as suspicions have grown, not just in the US, but worldwide, about China's lack of cooperation in identifying the source and the cause of this virus, it represents a real challenge, again, not just to this country, but more broadly. Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, wrote a tremendous piece in the recent Foreign Affairs magazine, in which he speculated about the prospect of a world without superpowers. His point being that given China's aggression and the US's diffidence, what does the world look like without any superpowers? And I would recommend to anyone who's watching to read the piece because it's very, very well done. But the phrase that sticks out to me, just as a spoiler alert, is the phrase that Prime Minister Rudd used was international anarchy. And as you mentioned, Pete, Rudd's nation of Australia is now attempting not just to begin an investigation into China's very suspicious conduct throughout this crisis, but trying to marshal worldwide support. And there is a group known as the Mid-Powers in both Europe and Asia that are beginning to form what I would call, somewhat regretfully, a post-US coalition, a task force, if you will, to take on these and other questions. And that's not to say that good, smart leaders in other countries can't have an impact here. But without very pronounced and visible US leadership, their likelihood of success becomes much, much less. Real quick on the domestic politics, because I know a lot of other people are going to want to talk about that also.
Yeah.
As someone who made campaign commercials for a living for many years, as somebody who made really nasty campaign commercials about my opponent for many years, there's more than enough footage of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump saying positive things about the Chinese leadership to fuel advertisements from now until November and well beyond. That said, even the president's strongest opponents, I think, would need to admit that after almost a half a century of conventional wisdom in which the leaders of both parties and presidents of both parties operated under the premise that increased economic engagement with China would lead to a flourishing of democracy there. Trump made a centerpiece of his campaign in 2016 that was no longer the case. And even for those who do not think highly of Trump on other matters, and obviously there are plenty who fit that description, it is worth noting that he became the first highly visible voice in either party to push back against that conventional wisdom. And what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is greater suspicion growing toward China, more and more concern about their horrific treatment of individuals in northwestern China, in Tibet, the increasingly strident approach in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the increasingly belligerent military approach in the South China Sea, and the increasingly confrontational economic approach with leading business figures from this country and around the world. And so what was conventional wisdom in October of 2016 no longer exists. And Trump will rightly draw some credit for that. It's difficult to see right now how much he will benefit from that, because like I said earlier, the Biden campaign is just as capable of criticizing Trump on some of the positive statements he's made about the Chinese in the past as the Trump campaign is against Biden. I suspect that issue turns out to be somewhat of a draw, but going forward, after November of this year, whoever's sworn in as president next January, whether it's Trump for a second 4-year term or Biden for an only term, is that president is going to be operating under the face of tremendous popular and political pressure to push back against China much more forcefully than we have since Nixon opened in the 1970s.
That actually opens, again, a door into another set of questions. As we pull back from the international focus to the national, obviously we not only have a presidential election forthcoming, but we also have a series of pivotal congressional elections. And so I wanted to get your read on both the Senate and the House. I thought one of the interesting things in looking at the landscape of the Senate races as well as the House races is that, at least looking at the real clear averages, while Republicans lead in the Senate, both in open seats as well as seats they're holding through 2020, 49 to 45, of the 6 toss-up states in which there will be Senate elections this coming November, 5 of them are currently held by Republicans. So 5 of the 6 toss-ups are currently held by Republicans. When you look at the House side, again, Democrats are leading. Obviously, they currently hold the House. Real Clear has them 213 to 190 with 32 toss-ups. But of the 32 toss-ups, 22 are currently held by Democrats. So 22 of the 32 are of the toss-up races are currently held by Democrats. So obviously we have the Mike Garcia, Christy Smith race just today over in CA 25, but wanted to get your sense as to where you see the House and Senate going, understanding that while Republicans lead in the Senate currently and Democrats lead in the House, their exposures are actually quite to the contrary when it comes to these 2020 races.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One, for all the good and smart things that the Republican political committees have done over the last couple of years to prepare for this election cycle, one place where they've fallen short in a very noticeable way was the Congressional Committee's recruitment efforts to convince top-tier Republican candidates to run against Democrats in those key races. And it's already looking like the Republican Congressional Committee's inability to recruit a higher quality of candidates is going to make it much, much more difficult for them to seriously challenge to reclaim the House. In many of those swing races, the Republican candidates have raised negligible amounts of money which suggests that they're not being taken seriously by party leadership and donors, even in their own communities. I suspect that Trump would have to win re-election by pretty close to a landslide margin for the House to shift at this point. That's looking like not a safe bet, but it's looking like the Democrats hold a very strong position there.
Mm-hmm.
The Senate is a tougher one to call. As you mentioned, 6 key races, and in fact, I'd narrow even a little bit further than that. Right now, as most of our participants know, the Republicans enjoy a 53-47 lead in the Senate, which means that if Joe Biden were elected president, the Democrats would need to win a net gain of 3 seats in order to maintain control in that chamber. If the president is reelected, they would need to win 4. Start with the Senate race in Alabama, where the Democratic incumbent Senator Doug Jones won in a special election under very unusual circumstances a couple years back. Mm-hmm. That looks like the Republicans' greatest likelihood to pick up a seat. And in fact, I stopped making predictions in November of 2016. That one would be a very difficult one for the Democrats to lose at this point. The next few, Republican Senate incumbents in Arizona, in Colorado, in Maine, and in North Carolina, those are going to be the races that decide the Senate. Interestingly, all 4 of the Democratic challengers have raised noticeably more money than the Republican incumbents. But it is worth noting that particularly if that Democratic seat in Alabama switches from Democrat to Republican, that means the Democrats would have to win all 4 of those highly contested races in order to win the Senate under a Biden presidency. And under a Trump presidency, it would still leave them 1 short. There's a few other races around the country which are worth taking a quick look at. Mm-hmm. The Senate race in the state of Michigan represents probably the Republicans' greatest chance, other than Alabama, to win a seat. A very, very talented candidate, John James, is running very well against an incumbent Democrat there.
Yep, and that's one of the real clear toss-ups. That's the only currently held Democrat Senate seat that Real Clear deems as a toss-up, and it is that race.
Yeah, and so and then the one other one the other 2 that look like they might be somewhat challenging for Republicans. One is in the state of Iowa, where Senator Joni Ernst is running for re-election, and which looks to be a closer than expected race. And then in the state of Montana, where the governor, Governor Bullard, who decided not to run for president and had indicated he would not run for the Senate seat, has now entered the race. So the Democrats can take back the Senate. And if you were to break down each race one by one, they would probably come out with a 1 or 2 seat majority, but that would require them winning basically every single race where the Republicans currently hold contested seats. So that one really is much more of a toss-up. And I just note lastly, before we go on, while the Democrats have raised much more money in these Senate races, the fact that the Trump re-election campaign has raised so much more money than Biden's campaign does, which means particularly in these Senate seats that are taking place in swing states, the Democratic Senate candidates' financial advantage might not be as important as under more conventional circumstances, simply because the Trump campaign will be spending so heavily at the same time in those states as well.
You know, I just want to go back to the House for a second, because I thought one of the interesting elements of the polling data showed that of the 32 toss-ups dubbed by Real Clear, 4 of them are currently held Democratic seats right here in the state of California. As I mentioned, we have the Garcia race is just today, but we have the other ones in Orange County, which flipped in the last election cycle. Your thoughts on the prospect of those flipping back to the Republican column or staying as they are?
Boy, that's dangerously close to asking me to make predictions, Pete. That stopped in November of 2016 for me. For those of you who didn't see this when I held it up earlier, you might not be able to tell that this mug that I'm holding up says "No to predictions, yes to coffee." I host a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall Thursday mornings at 11 a.m. And the staff there gave me this coffee mug because they got so tired of me saying I'm not going to make political predictions. But what I would say quickly, down, Pete, is going back to the point I made earlier about how important recruiting is, particularly for challengers. It looks like Republicans in those 4 Orange County seats recruited 2 excellent challengers, came up probably somewhat short in the other 2. Most likely outcome, with not a prediction, is it wouldn't be surprising to see 1 or 2 of those seats flip back, but it'd be very, very difficult to see the same kind of sweep in the Republican direction that we saw with the Democrats 2 years ago.
So now I'm going to pull down into the state level, and something very strange, and this goes to, again, a couple of the questions that I'm taking in through the chat feature here. The recent comments and back and forth between Elon Musk and a state assemblywoman, Lorena Gonzalez, which in terms that I can't even use here, it got that testy via Twitter, but speaks to, I think, at least what I'm seeing, some growing unrest around the state mandates or encouragements, followed by a number of cities in the state around the closing of businesses and the growing awareness of the economic costs that are being borne. Obviously, we're now seeing these historic rates of unemployment. We're seeing the GDP drop nationally, but also here in the state of California. I wonder if you could help us put into context, is this Elon Musk thing a thing? Is this one of those events that causes people to think differently about the Democrat view here in the state of California around business? Or is it something that, as Lorena Gonzalez is trying to paint this, as just billionaires versus workers, and we give enough handouts to billionaires, so why should we take seriously somebody who is, in this case, partly responsible for the hiring of thousands of Californians? Your thoughts on just the growing exhaustion felt, particularly here in California, around the economic picture and this back and forth between Elon Musk and Lorena Gonzalez?
Well, as many of you know, one of the many things that Pete and I share in common is we are both rabid, borderline, irrational fans of the Green Bay Packers. And every once in a while, and I'm sure Pete, you've gone through the same thing, 2 of our arch rivals will be playing against each other. There'll be a Bears-Vikings game. There'll be a Giants-49ers game. They'll say, "Hey, Dan, who are you rooting for?" The Bears are playing the Vikings. And I'll say, "I'm rooting for Earthquake."
Bus crash. That's right.
Look, while I have nothing personally against either Mr. Musk or Ms. Gonzalez, it's awfully tough to find a rooting interest in this. So first of all, let's start with Musk. I agree with him. I understand his frustration. He is a businessman, he is a jobs creator, and particularly in California, given his focus on technology and on alternative energies, he's the ideal business leader for a deep blue borderline indigo state like California. So I sympathize with him, just like I sympathize with local and county office holders and residents in the less populated areas of California who are wondering with some justification why they're being shut down because Los Angeles and San Francisco are still struggling with their challenges. And I do give Newsom some credit on this because he laid out what seemed to be what was obviously very precise, maybe a little bit too stringent, but at least a precise set of guidelines for each county to open.
Mhm.
And in fact, this morning, the first counties began to reopen in California with state approval. And if you live in a less populated area where there have been a very few cases, you ought to be able to open up at a more aggressive pace than a larger urban area where the challenge is still much greater. A former student of mine from another school where I teach, James Gallagher, represents the Yuba City area in the state assembly. He represents Paradise, the town that was so tragically hit by the wildfires last year. And James, I've watched with great pride, has been speaking out not against these measures as they relate to Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego, but in the communities that he represents, where the caseload is much, much lower, he feels they should be treated differently. And Newsom, maybe not as quickly as he'd like, is beginning to agree. So now you've got Musk, whose factory is not in rural California, but it's in Alameda County, one of the most densely populated parts of the state. And while I'm sympathetic to him, and while I think there are precautions that can be taken and should be taken that would allow him to open up, the same way the big three automakers are preparing to open week after next in Detroit, I don't know that this brand of civil disobedience is a particularly productive way to do it. I have to believe that someone of Musk's stature and influence could resolve this concern in conversations with the governor and his staff without a public confrontation. And I worry that by confronting the governor and the emergency regulations of the state the way he has, it sets a less desirable example for citizens who are, for our own reasons, bristling at the restrictions. Gonzalez, on the other hand, I must say I'm much less sympathetic toward. Just like Musk is entitled to be frustrated with the pace of the state government reopening, Gonzalez, a very vocal and influential, very liberal Democrat from San Diego, has every right to criticize him and to say he's doing the wrong thing. But the tweet, F -- Elon Musk, is not only inappropriate in its word choice, but to me it reflects the kind of anti-business attitude that doesn't do us much good, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're looking to find a way for the state's job creators to begin to move forward. So yeah, sort of like a Viking-Bears game, wouldn't you say, Pete?
Very good. I wanted to take it, then now jump back out to think about a post-pandemic world. And there is something you raised right there, especially about Assemblyman Gallagher's arguments around treating regions differently. I wonder if you think we might, as a country, think about politics differently and policy differently in a post-pandemic world. It seems to me that while so much of our focus in politics is on Washington, D.C. and what it does, that if this pandemic has done anything, it's reintroduced people to the concept of federalism and that states can act differently than other states and be held accountable for those actions. But also cities and regions can act differently and getting a new familiarity with what mayors do and what county supervisors do. It seems like there's been a bit of a civics lesson here in these last couple months. And I wonder if you thought, as we look out over the coming months and couple of years, if there might be a new appreciation for what's happening at the more local level.
Boy, it's a great point, Pete, and I think it's a very valid one. There's been quite a bit written in academic and other circles about sort of the celebrification of the presidency. And George Will in particular talks about this to great effect when he talks about the growing imbalance between the supposed balance of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch at the national level. But that celebrification of the presidency has had, I think, just as great an impact, if not a greater one, on a growing imbalance between Washington authority and the rightly held powers of state and local government. I'm old enough to remember when Bob Dole would campaign carrying around a copy of the 10th Amendment in his jacket pocket to remind voters that any power that wasn't specifically prescribed to the federal government belonged to the states. And I think in particular, the public approval ratings, the poll numbers that governors around the country are attracting through their handling of this crisis is instructive of the importance of their role.
Mm-hmm.
I point out to my students who read about such things in history books that before Barack Obama, George W. Bush came to the White House from the office of governor. So did Bill Clinton, so did Ronald Reagan, so did Jimmy Carter. And so just like at different points earlier in American history, when we look toward military leaders or diplomats as the logical pool of talent to draw from for our chief executive, for the better part of the 20th century, we looked at governors. And in recent years, that trend has ebbed primarily because they simply don't achieve the same level of visibility as a president or even a congressional leader. And the way Newsom here, or Cuomo in New York, and in both parties, Mike DeWine in Ohio, Larry Hogan in Maryland, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, these governors, whether they are necessarily agreed with in all their actions or not, have stepped up in a way that, to your point, Pete, reminds us that while Washington, D.C. tends to fascinate cable news hosts more than state capitals and county and local seats of government, that ultimately on the ground, hands-on governance plays a very vital role in the balance of powers in our society. So I think it's a great reminder, and the fact that so many Democrats have speculated about the possibility of Cuomo replacing Biden on the ticket this year, the fact that so many Republican governors and former governors are now being talked about in that context in a post-Trump era, suggests that the governors really have begun to refocus that conversation in a very productive way.
Well, Dan, we're at our last few minutes here, and I have one more question I'm going to draw from Abby Scott to end on a happier note. But before I do, I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us today for this webinar. This, again, is one in our series of politics and the pandemic. All of you who registered for this will be getting the recorded session sent to you within 24 hours, and we'll also send a couple links to some of the articles and books that Dan has mentioned in this session. Our next Politics and Pandemic webinar is set for 1 week from today, next Tuesday, the 19th. I'm delighted to welcome another one of my friends and terrific local government leaders, Rick Cole, who is the recently resigned city manager from Santa Monica, and is going to be talking about the impact of the pandemic on local government. These webinars are made possible because of the gracious support of our donors, many of whom I can see are on this webinar. And so for those of you who'd like to be a part of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy supporting family, we are going to put Matt Cutler's name in the chat feature, and we'll send that along in the email following this up. A great opportunity to join as an associate of the School of Public Policy, which is how we designate our annual giving supporters here to the school, which make events and webinars like this possible. And so again, thank you so much for being with us and for your support of the School of Public Policy. So Dan, we'll close on this happier note from such a bright light, one of our first soon-to-be second-year students, Abigail Scott, who asked a question about whether you see any signs of hope out there in the midst of what has been seemingly a trail of tears in some ways, just seemingly one piece of difficult news after another, whether it's on the political front or healthcare front or economic front. Is there anything that you're seeing out there, either bipartisan collaborations or different ways that governments are working with the private sector or nonprofit sector, anything that is giving you hope that coming out of this pandemic, we may think differently about our policy and politics?
Well, first of all, I just need to correct something, Pete. When you mentioned Abby Scott, you forgot to say Abby Scott, who's preparing to start her internship in the White House this summer after completing her first year in the public policy school at Pepperdine University. And like everybody else who's going to be back next fall, I'll be very, very excited to hear about her experience once it's concluded. And so again, I took a quick look earlier, but in addition to Abby, Pauline, Shelby, Zach, it's really terrific to almost see you guys. I'm flattered that you decided to participate in this. And while I won't see you blushing, I'm about to make you blush, because I'm going to tell everybody else on the call just how amazing you guys and your colleagues are, and how proud I am of all of you. I saw that there were a number of questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. And that's because professors like me and Pete tend to be a little bit more long-winded than we ought to be. And I'll just tell you, I'm working on that. So what I did, for anyone who would like it, for anyone who didn't have a chance to ask the question, is I entered my email address in the chat room in the chat box at the very end, dan.schnur@mindspring.com. And I also entered, as I mentioned earlier, I have the great fun hosting a weekly politics webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall on Thursday mornings. And I've entered the website where you can sign up for that should you want to inflict yourself with more of this in the future. And the one other thank you I want to add that Pete did before I actually answer the question is Melissa, who's been absolutely wonderful in helping us put this together. And for those of you who don't get to spend as much time at the school as you'd like, Melissa and Cheryl and Ashley and the rest of the team are just absolutely amazing. They do tremendous work. And for somebody like me who's still a newbie at Pepperdine, I'm very grateful to all of them for the terrific work they do. So Abby, why am I encouraged? I'm encouraged for a couple of reasons. And I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. When we talk about the greatest generation, we talk about the generation that came of age in the time leading up to the Great Depression and World War II, but led us through one of the most trying times in our nation's history and its aftermath. And while the country has faced tremendous challenges between 1946 and 2019, I'm comfortable saying we have not faced a crisis of this magnitude since the end of World War II. And I really do believe, and Peter Jennings, thank you for fixing the web address. I'm sort of a moron on this stuff. And I really do believe that this emerging generation, just like the greatest generation that Tom Brokaw wrote about, is going to be remembered in history as the generation that led this country to its next great time period of preeminence. And I say that not just because of the timing of living through a crisis like this one, but I saw something else, Pete, in this generation, even before 2020, that you and I have talked about before. And I think it's important, again, for those who might not spend as much time on campus to be aware of this. These millennials and these Generation Zers, or Generation C, as they're now calling them, they get a bad rap. And they get a bad rap for a lot of reasons, one being that they vote in smaller numbers than any generation in America today or in recent American history. But I think what's also worth noting is that that same generation, these same young people, and there's data to back this up, volunteer their time back in their communities at greater levels than any recent generation. Now, with any luck, should Pete and Melissa allow it, there's another webinar for another day on why that is. Why is it that a young person who take hours and hours and hours out of their week to bring meals to seniors, to teach at-risk children to read, to do neighborhood watches or community cleanups, why is it that a young person who devote hours to his or her community every week won't take 15 minutes every 2 years to vote? I have some thoughts on that, beginning with the embarrassing lack of civics education in California public schools, but that is a conversation for another day. And what I try in my classes is I try really hard to explain to students that I don't want them to stop volunteering. Volunteering isn't just noble, isn't just admirable, it's noble, and I want them to keep volunteering. But what I try to tell them is you can only clean up so many parks. You can only bring so many meals to so many seniors. If you want to make change on a grander scale, you need to step through the gates and get involved in the kind of traditional politics that so many of them find distasteful. But here's the other thing I've learned that they're getting through volunteering, and I will wrap up in just a minute, Pete. Volunteering doesn't require litmus tests the way political campaigns do. If I volunteer on a campaign, I'm volunteering with people who believe the same things I do, who have the same position on the issues that I do. And very quickly, unfortunately, I very quickly come to believe that the people on the other side are evil or stupid, as opposed to good members of our community who have ideas on how to fix our community's challenges that are slightly different than mine. When you volunteer, when you bring meals to the seniors, when you teach at-risk children to read, when you do a neighborhood watch or a community cleanup, nobody asks you if you're pro-choice or pro-life before you volunteer. Nobody asks you whether you're a supporter or an opponent of same-sex marriage or the capital gains tax or any other issue that we could be discussing. You get involved because you care about your community. And when you're done volunteering, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to agree on every single issue with everyone else who volunteered. But maybe you will be a little bit less likely to look at that fellow volunteer as someone who's evil or stupid just because they vote for another candidate. But instead are willing to look at them as a smart, community-minded individual with whom you can work. Ronald Reagan, as all of you know, Ronald Reagan's famous quote, he said, somebody who disagrees with me 20% of the time isn't my enemy, because he's somebody who agrees with me 80% of the time, which makes him my trusted friend and ally. And the coda that I'm hoping I think these young people are learning as they volunteer in their communities is to take that one step further. Someone who disagrees with me 80% of the time isn't my enemy either. She's someone I can work with 20% of the time. And it's harder to find that common ground when it's smaller. But I think that's the lesson that this next generation of leaders, that Generation C, is learning. And that's what I'm so optimistic about, that as Abby and Zach and Pauline and Shelby move into positions of political leadership, they're not going to compromise their political beliefs, not one iota, certainly not Zach and certainly not Shelby. But what they are going to remember, because of what they learned in their time in Pepperdine and their experience as volunteers, is that they can find ways to work with people on the other side, maybe not on everything, but on some things. And that's what keeps me optimistic. And that's what makes it so exciting for me to be in the classroom with these incredible young people once a week. So thank you for having me here today. And thank you even more for giving me the privilege to work with Pepperdine's public policy students. It's an honor and it's a privilege.
Well, Dan, thanks so much. That is a great note to end on. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Again, Dan's LA World Affairs Council morning webinars are on Thursdays, and we posted that as well. Please stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you again at one of these politics and pandemic webinars. Take care. God bless.